All right, I believe we are live. All right, everyone. Well, welcome to another week of Overflow, which we do every Monday at noon to talk about and unpack the sermon topic more and explore parts of it that you can't necessarily explore on stage in a sermon. And to help you guys.
All right, I believe we are live.
I am
All
listening
right,
to myself.
Well, welcome to
There we go. I muted myself. Your
wife would like to do that once in a while to you as well, but anyway.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
it's finally loaded and caught up. But anyways, and where we like to unpack the sermon, and that can help you guys leading your small groups. And we'll also be talking a little bit about some of the workbook stuff too. So I'm here. I'm Pastor Ryan, youth pastor. I'm here with Pastor Juno. He gave the sermon yesterday. So Juno, why don't you go ahead and give us a recap of what you talked about yesterday?
Okay, we looked at Mark. Maybe did I say John yesterday? Anyway, I think I said Mark. Mark 4, 35 to 41, and it's the story of Jesus calming the sea, and the disciples wake him up because he's sitting in the back of the boat and they're panicking, and he rebukes the wind, tells it to calm down, and he, in verse 40, turns to the disciples and he says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you have no faith?" And really asking the question. And so the idea of going below the iceberg is really asking the question about really why we feel and think toward situations or some of the people we do, or what's our go-to reaction to things. And that's this whole idea of going below the iceberg, because only 10% of an iceberg is actually seen. Everything's below the surface. And some scholars will say, even as our personalities, there's really only 10, 20% that people actually see. The rest is hidden. And I did not say that yesterday, but anyway, and I hope people got that analogy. And so much of who we are is below the surface. And it often is complex. And I talked about that. That things are just complex. People are. We're humans. And there are some people that just think that as long as I don't have to talk about it, then I'm over it. And the reality is, by not talking about it, it's what we're going back to this analogy. You're shoving it under the water. You're shoving it below the surface because you think you're done with it. In reality, you're not. And it's just steaming and brewing under that surface. And it raises its ugly head, or it causes you to do things that you're sometimes questioning. And so in a nutshell, that's what that is. And the idea of, I use the Titanic, that it sank because of what was really under the water, not necessarily the little bit of the iceberg that they could actually see. And I didn't say this yesterday either, but sometimes I think we can be so overconfident in ourselves that our life is together and we're going to do just fine. But if we haven't dealt with the things underneath, sooner or later, and maybe it's going to be at those stress points, or when your anxiety rises, the under the surface things, the bottom of the iceberg, causes painful collisions in life, and most of the time it's in our relationships, or it could be in some of our behaviors as well. So anyway, that's what it is, and it's really the idea of maybe asking, well, why am I so upset? You don't have to wait till we do this course, but when you just find yourself irritated and angry or in tears, to be asking what's behind that. So really, under the iceberg could almost have been labeled what's behind that, and that's all this is trying to figure out what's behind some of your actions. And then I shared those two stories of when my wife passed away, and then with my mom being very intimidated to go to church because of the clothes she had or didn't have. So.
Yeah, I remember you talking about those stories, and I think, in the case of your mom, the underlying part of the iceberg is worried about being judged by others and feeling like not appearing, like if I don't wear the right clothes, they'll judge me and I feel like I'm not good enough, being part of the iceberg. So, but I think the next question is, which I feel like you already kind of answered in your sermon recap, but you can add to it. is what does the metaphor of explore the iceberg mean? And why is it a good representation of us as people? And since you already answered kind of it in your sermon recap, I'll go first and then you can add on whatever you want. But
Sure.
I think like, and by the way, and I want to say, as always, if anyone listening, you have any questions, thoughts, anything, please write them in the chat. We really love to interact directly with you guys as we do this. That makes it more fun for us and helps us feel like we're, interacting with our people. So the question is, what does the metaphor of explore the iceberg mean, and why is it a good representation of us as people? And I think for me, I think it's both helpful when we think about interacting with other people, thinking like, hey, I can only see 10% of what's going on, and I don't know what's going on in their life at home. I don't know what they're actually thinking behind their actions. I don't know a bunch of other things about them. We really only see like the surface level of people or whatever they choose to reveal. There's always a lot more going below the surface. But I also think it's helpful to think about ourselves more like that, because I think there are ways subconsciously that our family history or relationships we've had in the past or wounds and pain that we've had in the past can cause us to act in a certain way without even realizing that they're causing us to act in a certain way. So I think there's a part of ourselves that's always the bottom of the iceberg below the surface that we don't even fully see or understand about ourselves. And the only person who can see 100% of your iceberg is God. That's it. You can't see 100% of your iceberg. I can't see 100% of my own iceberg or someone else's iceberg. Only God knows us fully inside and out. And that's why I think this is important, to talk about it like this, and but also to try and explore it more so that we know better how God made us and how our experiences have formed us as people. Is there anything that you'd want to add about exploring the iceberg to that, Juno?
Unfortunately, it's not a one-time thing. Hey, we're doing this in our study. Let's just go through today and I'm all set. Nope. It's an ongoing discipline, really. And when you were talking to, what came to my mind was something my wife always said, is that, you know what, everybody has a story. And the thing is that below, looking below the iceberg and going below and stuff like that, looking under the surface, it's all the same thing of saying everybody has a story. And so that helps me when, sometimes people are just so mean and angry, but often it's about their story. What's going on at home, at school, at work that is causing them to react? That just seems like that's out of nowhere, or that's a real overreaction. And so it causes me, as I need to ask myself, why am I reacting that way to things as I meet and interact with others who are just at times extraordinarily upset, is to ask them the question, where's that coming from? Or I'm sensing some deep anger toward me. And I just said, let's talk about Lent or whatever. Like I said in my sermon, it's different things are triggering different people. And the things like you mentioned, again, God knows us and loves us. And these events have helped form us. And yet it's amazing how God can use those events to still to use us for his glory. So.
Yeah. And I really like what you said about how it's an ongoing thing and it never really ends. There's no end game to this.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I think that's a lot like the concept of following Jesus, period. Like there is no, oh, good, I need to go through it once and then I'm done. Now I figured out Jesus,
I finished the book. I'm done. Okay.
Yeah. I read the Bible cover to cover. Now I'm done following Jesus. It's an ongoing thing. It never really ends. And it's not like, I know, some people, maybe I think at times people have the mentality like, oh, well, I prayed the prayer, accepted Jesus in my heart. I'm good. I don't have to worry about following Jesus anymore. But if that's your mentality, then I think the question is, did you really surrender your entire life to Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
Because it is an ongoing thing and it is something that never ends. And following Jesus every day is hard every day because there's always the temptation to sin, things that challenge us, pull us away from our paying attention and following Jesus. So it's really exploring the iceberg is an ongoing thing, just like following Jesus is an ongoing thing. And I think exploring the iceberg more and learning more about ourselves and growing in emotional intelligence helps us to follow Jesus more, because that helps us to not like, you mentioned in your sermon, like, what's causing me to push my buttons? If we know that better, then when our buttons are pushed, we can try to react in healthier ways. And that helps us to love other people more, to not get angry, to be slow to anger as Jesus commands. So I think that leads naturally into our next question. What has been a time in your life where your iceberg has caused you to sink? And that comes also from your sermon where you said it's important we take the time to pause and to be intentional to look under the water and find something that may cause us to sink. Because if we don't, it may be caused to sink in ways we don't even know. Mm-hmm. So when's there been a time in your life where something under your iceberg has caused you to sink?
Well, here's something that I have to constantly keep in check, or I think something will sink. And that is everybody is not the same. And this is from a pastor's perspective. Everybody does have a story. And so when unfortunately, people lash out at pastors. They're maybe because they can't do it anywhere else in life, and they think they can get away with doing it to their pastor. And it's sometimes for the littlest things. And like, they're attacking us as if we're the Antichrist and we just did some. And it's just like, all we did was move a table from A to B. It's just, some of it's so simple. And I just think if I responded with the same energy they sent me, I would be sinking a lot of relationships. But it's really just to pause and to keep asking some questions and to get an idea of, oh, that's what you're really after, is you're not feeling valued. Or maybe, what you did 10 years ago, you were in charge of this ministry, and now we're making some changes and you're not being brought in and you're feeling worthless. Well, let's talk about that. Anyway, so it's I think the icebergs of some explosive people that if I just need to pause and listen before I react. Pause and listen and then respond appropriately. And my style, and because underneath my iceberg are some issues with some pastors who never get back to their congregation, never communicate. Mm-hmm. And so I am just always trying to communicate back and answer quickly back. And at times that is not the healthiest. And so it's okay if I don't have to get back with them in 5 seconds. I can say, you know what, let me get back with you tomorrow. And again, that slows the conversation down and allows a little bit more time to literally process things together. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, whether being frustrated with people attacking you at church, if you let that anger or let frustration or let something rule you, then that, like you said, that'll sink a lot of relationships. And that, if you let that part of your iceberg win, in a sense. And I think for me, a time in my life where my iceberg has caused me to sink is I've at times in my life, really consistently struggled with a certain level of social anxiety and worried about being judged and worry about people not liking me and things like that. And sometimes I've avoided certain social interactions because it gives me anxiety. But where that's caused me to sink, I think then is especially right when I started becoming a youth worker, first as a volunteer, later as a pastor, having social anxiety in relationship with students, especially if they give attitude about something and things like that. Sometimes I'll just try to avoid it or avoid that situation, avoid those students. But if I'm going to be in youth ministry, I'm going to be a youth pastor. I can't just ignore a student if there's one bad experience with them or things like that. And I think right when I started, I struggled with that because I try to sometimes avoid bad situations and I can be a little conflict averse. And if I'm like that as a pastor and leading people, then there will be times where I'm damaging a relationship by avoiding a problem that needs to be addressed, or I'm damaging a relationship by avoiding a student who maybe gave me or gave the youth pastor when I was a volunteer a hard time, So I think, like, for me, being aware of my level of social anxiety, which I think to explore my iceberg, and I've processed this before, but like comes from being bullied a lot in elementary school, not really having almost any friends for a lot of elementary school and stuff like that. I can't let that control how I act now as an adult. And I've worked through that, and I think I do it a lot better now than I did 5 years ago, and all that. So anyways, so that's just an example of how our iceberg can cause us to sink, and has caused me to sink as a youth pastor and youth worker at times. So the next question is, how do we, now that we've explored this concept, how do we do this? How can we as disciples intentionally explore the iceberg, especially in a way that'll help us to thrive spiritually? How do we engage in this practice?
Again, part of it is, I think, when you catch yourself in those highly emotional moments, why am I so excited to see this? Or why am I so discouraged to see this? I think when our emotional pendulum swings, maybe there's something under the iceberg pushing it one way or the other. I have several friends who I'll email several pastors and say, boy, does this bother you when somebody does this? And what they'll say is, oh, that's no big deal. They're just blah, 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 or it's not a part of their iceberg. So it is literally a non-issue. And so by processing it with other people, and that's a part of the whole thing here, I think in community with people you trust and love, they will often say, all I need them to say is, oh, ignore it, let it go. It's no big deal. Don't worry about it. Figure out, why are you distrusting that person, or why are you feeling that way, or being manipulated? That takes more time. But the one thing, if one thing's pushing my button, or the straw to break the camel's back, that's when you normally realize, oh, this is not normal. This is not healthy. So I find community helps me to stay on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I really like what you said about those like high emotional moments. For me, like whenever I get really angry, really frustrated, and this is something I've developed over time as a discipline, I really try to use that high emotional moment as like a red flag, or like a yellow light. Like, Ryan, you need to slow down, stop, and think like, okay, why am I so worked up? Why am I so heated right now? And Sarah, my wife, will be the first person to tell you I don't always do that very well, but I've tried to integrate that, like, hey, if I'm really, really worked up or angry or frustrated about something, like what's really going on here? And is this anger really justified, or do I need to bring it down a few notches? Mm-hmm. And I think to answer the original question, how can we intentionally, as disciples of Jesus, explore our icebergs? I think there's a lot of it is actually covered in the workbook this week, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I think one thing is just to express our sadness, express our pain when we're hurt. I think sometimes in the church, and by the church, I mean, the American church in general, the Christian church in general, there's an unhealthy tendency to be like, hey, if you have negative emotions, you just need to bottle those up, and you need to not express that, because following Jesus is about being content no matter what, mm-hmm. or something like that. And I think that's really a false narrative, because I don't think that's how Jesus tells us to live. And in the workbook this week, there's a example in the Psalms where David's experiencing pain, and he goes through the process of lament and bringing his emotions to God. So I think rather than bottling it up, we need to be willing to talk about these things both with other people and to bring them to God, and bring our feelings to God, and being willing to talk about them with God. And I'll just read just a couple little chunks of this Psalm of Lament where David's really unbottling his feelings and letting it all hang out. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cry of anguish? And then he concludes this on later by saying, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. So just that as an example of really like being willing to talk about your pain, to bring it to God, to wrestle with the hard emotions, and to do it not in a way saying like, oh, you're a bad Christian because you're not being joyful right now or content right now, but acknowledging we all have negative emotions. That's okay. And we can bring those to God.
Yeah. And I agree. It's almost like the grieving process. Some people think, I get 3 days off work, so that's all I need to grieve, and obviously we know that's a horrible standard for grieving, but you'll most likely never get through it, but you just need to continually walk through it and address it head on at times. And so I think the same with the whole, what's under the iceberg. And if it's something that's ticked us off and made us angry, it's okay to say to God, that pisses me off, Lord. Why does that happen? Or, why do people do this? And then why do I always, process that and even lament that to the Lord really does help bring us, I'll say me, a little more level-headed. So then I can say, Ryan, I'm just sensing versus me attacking you for what I perceived as you attacking me. Anyway, it helps slow the conversation. It helps slow the heated conversation down. So it's a little bit more, not manageable, but more civil at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that prevents us from acting on our worst impulse from our really high emotional place because I think acting on impulse like that can really damage the relationship. If you say something you didn't mean, something that maybe is really cuts deep to the other person, that can really damage the relationship. And as followers of Jesus, I think that's important to make sure that doesn't happen. So moving on from how can we do this intentionally, I think the workbook has us do some activities, or if you're in a small group or a small group leader, you'll be doing some of these questions later this week. But part of exploring the iceberg is talking about our family history, because that'll help us understand like maybe things we learned from our parents and how they wired us. And then, the workbook has an activity to explore the iceberg that has us write, what are you angry about? What are you sad about? What are you anxious about? What are you glad about? And really take really a lot of time to go through all those things, both past and present, and work through them. And then after that activity, it asks the question, and this is the question that I want us to answer, Juno, is how did the family that you grew up in express anger, sadness, and fear?
I'd probably say the one way would be loudly for every one of those. But you know what? I think it would. I'm not sure if you've heard of the dump trucking thing, where you just don't mention things, and then you just keep throwing them in the dump truck, and then all of a sudden somebody hits that button, and you just unload that dump truck.
I saw where that was going. Yep.
And it's just like, so that happened at times, but my family, I think we usually just talked about it, or talked about it loudly, or, didn't ask the other person's side, but just was accusatory and didn't think the best of the other person, just let them have it. But I had 3 sisters. I'm the third of 4 kids. We were all a year apart. And having 3 sisters, I'm pretty sure they're not watching this, so I can say this. Having 3 sisters, I saw how delayed communication in relationships was so damaging. And I just remember that being a significant event as a brother, seeing my sisters so upset that all they needed was a conversation. And so I don't know if that's one of my buttons, or that's why I probably, no, it's probably one of my iceberg experiences that make me lean into having difficult discussions pretty readily, because without them, it just damages the relationships even more. But if you have those conversations, even though they're painful, it really does help the relationship in the long haul. And so I think it's one of those things. And so I probably within my mom and dad, I don't know what they did. It just wasn't always healthy. It wasn't healthy. I did not. What I learned from them was to get my parenting model from. There were like 3 or 4 couples in the church who all of a sudden, I know there's a technical name, not reparenting, but had some new tapes or had some new tools in my tool bag on how to communicate, because I saw all these other couples in the church that were doing it well. It's like, oh, so my family, how they handle it isn't the only way to handle things. Oh, because now I had other options in my tool bag that weren't there. So I don't know if that answers your question, buddy.
Sorry, I just realized I was muted still.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyways, I was typing something, so I muted myself. I think that's really good because that's an example of how like exploring your iceberg in a group, like a small group, like kind of what we're going to be doing this week, helped you to move to realize your family's ways and the only way of doing things, and maybe help you grow in a healthy way. And I like the dump truck metaphor. I think for me, my family, in terms of like anger, my mom was kind of like that sometimes. I think I was too, and so was my older brother. Where if there was other stresses or other outside factors at work, it was easy to like kind of almost lash out and, like you said, unload on someone else when, and get angry about a minor thing when really something else is stressing you out. So I think in terms of how my family that I grew up in, how we dealt with anger, it was kind of wild, wild west in a sense, where it was just like, I don't know, it felt like it was between me and my mom and my brother. We were angry a lot, fighting a lot, didn't hold back many punches, and kind of went at it. My dad was almost 100% above that, and was always kind of the peacemaker, and I think showed a really good model of how to do that. So I really value him and look up to him for that. But as far as the other ones, sadness and fear, my family almost never talked about sadness and fear, and I never expressed that, and that wasn't something for us to bring up. When I was sad or afraid, at least once I became like junior high, I wouldn't really talk to either of my parents about any of that stuff, because and I think it didn't seem like we talked about those emotions. We just got angry at each other when we were angry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that was maybe not the healthiest model of how to do it. And I think, my parents, I love my parents and they did the absolute best they could, but I think there's maybe areas where I see in that where I want to grow and do better with my future family, including my kids, and with my wife now, of course.
Yes. And on that, I know there are some couples that will not have an argument in front of their kids. It is always behind closed doors. That was not me and Mackenzie. I mean, me and my wife in front of Mackenzie.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know how much of that I should talk with Mackenzie this summer. I don't know how much that she actually remembers. But my wife and I would have disagreements, and it's important for the kids to figure out, you can disagree and still love each other. You can disagree and still move forward. You just disagree. And so that came to mind. And then the idea that, what was it? Anger. Anyway, thought left my mind. I had it right there.
Yeah.
Mackenzie watching mom and dad. Anyway, so the blessing of divorced parents is that we talked about a lot of those feeling about anger and sadness and fear a ton, because it'd been going bad marriage for years. But as we were in a junior and senior and sophomore, junior and senior in high school, there were a lot of heartfelt conversations with my mom and my sisters that were just good conversations. And that's one of the, I don't want to say benefits of divorce, but at least that's not I wouldn't make that a title for a sermon. But from that, we learned to talk and listen.
Yeah, and I think what I hear you saying is like it was a silver lining of a bad situation that you had to your mom had to process, and your sisters process those really hard things and help you learn and how to process them and all that. So I get what you're saying. Yeah, benefits of divorce. You're right. That's not a very good title for it, but I totally get what you're saying, and that's good stuff there.
Yeah.
So anyway, so exploring our family history, learning how that might have affected us, talking about how that might have affected us is a great way to explore the iceberg. And the last question that we have is also kind of from the workbook, which talks about how anger is often a surface emotion, and that when we're angry, it's often really good. There's often something deeper going on there, like a deeper wound that's causing that anger. And then, so when angry, it's good to look behind the emotion of anger and ask the question, what am I afraid of? Or what am I hurt or sad about? Because often fear or sadness and pain is going to be driving your anger. So then the question that I would like, the last question I'd like us to discuss before signing off is, when have you been angry where it was really some fear or hurt or sadness that was really driving your anger?
I think I also mentioned it in the sermon. When dealing, again, I've worked at several churches and have numerous friends in churches, but when churches just go back to protecting themselves and not wanting to do anything, or even the dress code stuff, I can find myself just getting angry. And why? Because we're turning away the lost, or we're just taking care of it. We're just playing house. And I just do not think God has called us to play house in the church. But church is going to get messy. It's going to get awkward. That's okay. Mm-hmm. And so I can get angry when I see church leaders trying to spiritualize behavior and creates a wall between us and the unchurched. Really, the old holier than thou, or creates sort of these systems that if I start to see them going up, or people afraid to take a risk, I can become angry on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe call it righteous anger. How's that? We'll put
absolutely. And
I do believe in righteous anger, but
yeah. And I do too. I want to say I don't think the emotion anger is always a bad thing. We see God get angry in good ways, and that's good. And we saw Jesus get angry in good ways. I think it's important that we get angry at the right things, such as injustice. And maybe if we're angry at the really small things, like our spouse not leaving the toilet seat down, hint, hint, honey. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Then we should revisit our anger, and maybe we're getting angrier than we should. Hint, hint, honey. No, anyways, I'm just not. I'm being funny. I'm being funny.
Or buy a house with more than one bathroom. No.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Isn't her bathrooms? No, okay.
Yeah. Well, my apartment has 2 bathrooms, and sometimes it feels like we need to do that. Anyways,
okay,
that's a whole nother thing. But so I think for me, there's been a time that I've been angry where it was really some fear or hurt or sadness driving that emotion. Not much makes me angry. And my dad was like that too. He almost never got angry. It was really my mom being angry and my dad being peacekeeper. And I feel like I take more after my dad now that I've grown and matured, and I try to play that peacekeeper. But the one thing that I do consistently get really angry really quickly about is when I feel like someone's, mainly Sarah, to be honest, in my marriage, is when I feel like someone's getting angry at me and I don't deserve it. Like as soon as someone gets, but that also is just like, even if my wife just comes to me with this tone of frustration in her voice or tone of annoyance in her voice about something that in my head is small and not a big deal, I'm immediately getting like really angry. Like, why are you like causing conflict by bringing this in an annoyed way when it's not a big deal? And I think for me, where that really comes from is dealing with so much conflict and like constantly fighting with my older brother, my mom growing up. Like I'm trying to avoid that. I'm trying to like get past pain in a sense and past. And I'm afraid that if we do get angry, it's just going to devolve into this really intense arguments and fights that I often had in my childhood. So I've almost gone kind of from like getting angry really easily all the time to acting like all anger is wrong and we just need to avoid it and we should always be nice to each other. When in fact, I think there are times in relationships where like if Sarah asks me to schedule a doctor's appointment for us or something, if I don't do that, she has every right to be frustrated and angry with me and say, hey, I need you to do better. So I think in that way, like I've experienced anger when I think the pain or stuff from my past and childhood is really driving that anger, and where I need to, in a sense, handle it more in an emotionally mature, emotionally healthy way. And that affects my relationships and relationship with my wife now. And that's why we're doing the EHR, Emotionally Healthy Relationship series. So
okay.
Anything else that I think that takes us, it's 12:30, about 12:35. So we're about ready to wrap up. Juno, do you have any final thoughts or things you want to share about anything we discussed?
I think, again, just the idea of looking under the surface, it's just scary for many people if you haven't done it. Because it may show an area of your life that you just haven't dealt with. And just like, well, no time like today, just get after it. And I do think the more you do it, the less intimidating and scary it becomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think for me, the biggest time of emotional growth in my life was in college. And part of that was because my sophomore year of college, when I transferred to APU, I took counseling for about 6 months, and it was free counseling that was offered as a student at the school. And going to counseling and, talking through my family issues, talking through stuff like that, I learned so much about myself, how I'm affected by my past. It helped me to kind of grow up in a sense. So exploring my iceberg in therapy and counseling was huge for me to grow emotionally and spiritually. And I would say, not that I don't think everyone needs to go to therapy or counseling, but I think everyone would benefit from going to therapy or counseling. Some people need it more than others, but I think we would all benefit from it. So all that to say, it's always challenging, and you can't always go to therapy and counseling, but just to talk through things with other people, process things with people you trust. Don't be afraid of the iceberg. Don't be afraid of your past, because it affects us in ways we don't even understand. And then talking about it, processing it, is how we grow in emotional intelligence and grow. And that helps us to follow Jesus better and to love others better. So.
And it's really the idea of exploring it is to avoid it, is to be able to be aware of it. So next month or next season, next Christmas, the family can avoid the meltdown. That's all ties in there with the iceberg. Ooh. You can avoid the meltdown because you've dealt with it this year, and you've dealt with it over the few months in a very healthy way. And so it's a whole different holiday experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even in the last year, I've done a much better job at going home to be around my mom and my older brother, especially my older brother, who we still have kind of the sibling arguments and get angry at each other about. But I've done a much better job at being better myself and avoiding the situations where we'd have conflict and being more loving and peaceful at all times. So my family experience in the last year has gotten a lot better because I've dealt with this. And then also because I've really strategically said, I've strategically said, I am going to avoid the topics that make my brother angry, but instead, and if they come up, speak in love about them, things like that. So it's helped my family relationships too. All right. Well, that wraps us up. Thank you all for coming to Overflow.
Thank you.
I hope this has helped you process the sermon topic and helped you maybe prepare to lead or be in a small group later this week. As always, if you have any questions or anything during Overflow, we always encourage you to leave them in the chat, but you can also, send them to us. If you have a question for one of us, you can email us or find our stuff on the website. And because we like engaging with you, the people, on these things. We don't just do it because we like to hear ourselves talk. So yeah, everyone have a great week, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Monday for another Overflow.